Hello. So you see me today in not a field, but in a building. I've come away with the family for a few days and we're staying somewhere really lovely. And the plan was to do some painting because we're right in the middle of nowhere, amazing countryside, amazing scenery. But it's also the UK, so it's also absolutely hammering it down with rain constantly. So I didn't want to get Laura's camera wet. Also, paints and paper in the rain, probably not a good combination. So I thought, you know what? Let's switch things up for this one. So I'm determined to do some painting, so we can do it inside. I've been out, I waited for a bit of a break in the weather, so I managed to get a couple of nice shots. Actually, it ended up being pretty dramatic because all the clouds were sort of rolling across, and the one moment I had where there was a bit of a break, it was very dramatic. Lots of sun where I was, but then sort of surrounded by this just chasm of cloud everywhere that was threatening the rain that was about to come in a couple of minutes. And it's currently hammering it down still. I don't know whether you can see that in the back. So yeah, instead I'm set up on the table. I've got my photo ref, so I'm going to be working from a photo today instead. And yeah, it's going to be slightly different, more like what I was used to doing before I started trying to do this plein air stuff. So hopefully this should feel somewhat familiar. I do feel a little bit like I'm missing all of the real world colours that I got from just looking at it versus what I have with the photo. But the composition's nice, and I've got the memory of everything that I saw. So yeah, let's see how we get on with this one. Okay, so you can see we've got the usual start. I've got a rough sketch at the moment, super rough, just blocking out the sort of general composition of the space. Given that I'm not outside with the real subject matter, I'm going to get, hopefully, Laura to do some excellent editing magic, and she can bring up the photo round about now and show you what it is I'm planning on painting. You can see I've had to turn on some of the lights in the house because it's so dark outside because the weather's so bad. So be interesting to sort of deal with the fact that I've got some yellowish kind of light from the building over the top of everything. But it's kind of what I was used to before I started trying to do this outside. So if anything, this should feel slightly familiar. I've got my palette over here, which I'm going to be doing all my mixing on, which usually would be the canvas. But since we don't have to use it for that, I've got the table instead to lean on, which is nice and sturdy. It's not going to wobble. I think today we're going to be using a palette of... so we're going to have some ultramarine blue, some lemon yellow. I am going to use a little bit of the deep yellow as well. We've got some titanium white, burnt sienna as well. And depending on whether I'm brave enough, we might use some carmine red, but a very small amount. But yeah, that's the plan. I think mainly we're going to be using mainly these ones, I think. Based off of the picture that you've seen, hopefully that should make sense. So the first thing I'm going to do here is establish my darkest colour. So I was actually trying to get something equivalent to what I could get as a black from the mix of colours I was using, which was basically the red, yellow and the blue all together. The idea being that I always try to avoid pure blacks just because I feel they kind of take the life out of a painting. And so you always got that little hint of colour in there, even in your sort of darkest values. And then outside of that, starting to establish the sort of main, I guess the two main areas of colour in the painting. So the green of the grass in the mid and foreground, and then that sort of bluish grey tone to that stormy sky that was off in the background behind it. The other thing that's worth mentioning here is I think I sort of defaulted back to an old habit at this point where I was trying to be quite true to the colour palette that was captured in the photograph, which is one of the other reasons I've tried to start doing this outside, because I think it forces you to look at things differently and you get a better sense of the colours in the scene. But yeah, at this stage I was really trying to be fairly close to what I'd caught on the camera. And in paint that's quite difficult to do, because obviously given the lighting conditions and everything, the image was actually quite monochromatic. So there was a point where I started to go, do you know what, no, let's rely on some of the memories I had of this rather than purely going off of the photo. After all, that is what I've talked about in the past, you know, one of the beauties of painting is trying to get something that feels different or provide something extra to what you would normally get from just a pure photograph. Okay, so we're kind of at that point where I feel like I'm starting to get an idea as to how this thing should work. So just to sort of talk through the scene a little bit with my pointy finger. We've got a tree guy here. There's this like dry stone wall, which is a common feature up north. Less hedgerows, more stone walls. So that's sort of creating this nice silhouette in the midground. And then at the time, because I had this break in the clouds, I've got this nice strong sort of hit of sunlight towards the sort of the front, the foreground, and all the green grass. I've punched that in quite yellow at the moment, but the idea is I'm going to use something more accurate, but that yellow should hopefully then sort of stay poking through and give a bit of a sense of warmth from the sun. And then the tricky bit, and the bit that's, I guess, is the main point of the whole image, right? It's the main focus, is this sort of cool band of clouds that we had. So this was this sort of stormy band of rain that was coming in towards me at the time, and it was creating these really dramatic silhouettes and just had this really interesting play with stuff that looked super dark and menacing in the background, and then you sort of had this nice hit of light in the foreground. So that's the bit that I'm gonna probably spend the most time wrestling. Yeah, I think once that's starting to feel like what I saw at the time, then I'll start to feel happy. Again, I've gone quite blue with this at the moment. I might sort of dial this back down and go for something that's a little bit more neutral. I'm trying to sort of suggest with the brush strokes some of the sense that the rain was sort of coming out of these big storm clouds as they're rolling in. You know, when you see stuff in the distance and you kind of get that hazy sort of falling veil of rain that sort of it tells you you're about to get soaked if you stay outside for much longer. Common sight in the UK. So that's what we're going to do. That's what I'm going to mainly concentrate on. I'm obviously going to try and strengthen up some of these silhouettes as well with the trees and some of the bits and bobs in the main landscape, but they're the bits that I'm focusing on. I think round about here was when I started to finally get the courage to start thinking about tackling that mid-ground hill that was off in the distance. There was an absolute ton of detail in it, and it was all crammed into quite a small space, so I found it quite intimidating, if I'm being totally honest. And One of the things that I've always found really enchanting about other people's paintings when I've looked at them is when they've managed to get that really beautiful sense of atmosphere and distance in a painting, and so that was something that I knew I wanted to get across. I hadn't really got it at this point, and there was at the time there was quite a lot of red and sort of reds and yellows in the distance from some of the bracken that had been up on the hill. And that's where that part of the palette could start to come through a little bit more, and I thought it was going to be quite a nice way of separating sky from foreground. But this was also when I'd eventually sort of given in to trying to replicate those quite muted tones in the photograph, and instead I started thinking more about relying on that memory of being there. So I started to go a little bit more intense with some of the colours, started to get a few more blues in the storm clouds and in the rest of the sky. I really felt like that was the way that I could give the whole thing a little bit of an identity and yeah, a bit of punch. The other thing that you'll see me do in a little while is a little bit of what I've been hearing termed as optical blending, where rather than trying to mix the colours on the palette, you'd start to try and put some small dashes and indications of a certain colour in other areas of the image, kind of pure without being mixed, and allow the viewer to mix the colours in their eyes as they're looking at it. At this point there was quite a lot of separation between what was blue sky and what was green foreground, and so adding some of those little dashes of blue from the sky into the foreground was something that really helped gel everything together a little bit more. Hi again. I'm back home, as you can see. I'm no longer up north. I was going to obviously film it all in one go and show you the finished result, but my wonderful children came back, which was wonderful, but they are also very noisy, so I thought rather than doing the sort of finish of the video there and then, I'd take a bit of time until it was quiet again so I could actually show you without all of the ruckus in the background. So here we go. This is the finished result. I was actually pretty happy with this one. It was one of those paintings where I was like, is this gonna work? Is this gonna work? And then all of a sudden things just started to fall into place, which is honestly one of the most satisfying feelings in the world. And half the reason I do this sort of thing. So yeah, here you go. So we got that sort of heavy band of cloud that was coming through at the time. Managed to get some pretty good blacks out of the colour palette that I was mixing. So there was no actual black in the painting itself. This was just a mixture of the main sort of primary colours that I was using to get that really dark value. And then that sort of balance between the sort of yellows and the blues, between the sort of greens in the foreground and the sky, seemed to end up working pretty nicely. I've been doing quite a lot of brushing up on colour theory recently, and I say brushing up, actually learning, because everything that I'd done previously to this had always been based off of gut instinct and yeah, gut feel. So I wanted to try and put some actual knowledge alongside that gut feel stuff, because I've always felt fairly confident with colour. Like it's one of those things that I've always felt like I had a pretty good sense of, but yeah, actually backing that up with some technical knowledge, if you like, has been great. And one of the things that I have learnt from watching a few other people talk about this stuff is that actually the way that I've tended to work in the past, I've quite often relied on this concept of optical blending, which is basically the idea of putting down sort of raw colours on the page rather than necessarily mixing them in the palette. and then letting your eyes do the blending for you. So you sort of end up with this sort of stippled, speckly kind of look. But there's something really fun about it. I quite like playing with little dots of colour here and there to really bring everything out. So that kind of happened with this. I think when we had the sort of blue sky thing happening, as soon as I started dropping some of those little bits of blue into the grass and to the trees and everything, it all sort of started to gel together, and it felt like the palette started to harmonise. And hopefully you sort of caught that in the video. Apologies for some of the lighting in that video. I know it wasn't great with shadows and specular highlights, but hopefully the weather's going to get a little bit better now. So this coming weekend I'll be back outside. I've got a few locations that I'm quite excited about trying out with some really nice vistas and things. So yeah, so that should be pretty good. The only other thing I wanted to mention was if you want to see some stills of this stuff rather than me just sort of holding up to camera and the stuff from the video, everything is going on Instagram as well. So if you head over to Paint with Penrose on Instagram, all of the paintings from the plein air work is up there. And I've also started dropping in some paintings that I've done in the past, that I've done over slightly longer time periods. The plein air stuff is great because it forces me to be quick and not deliberate too much, and also helps me get just more prolific, I guess, with the work I'm doing. I want to create more, and this is a great way of sort of forcing that. So rather than spending a couple of days with a painting, I'm sort of going outside and saying, right, I'm going to capture this in a couple of hours. And that sort of speed sort of forces you to make some fairly crucial decisions much more quickly than you might have done in the past, which is outside of my comfort zone, but feels like it's being really useful. But as an example of some of the stuff that you'll see on the Instagram, so I uploaded this one. So this is a shot from a trip that I took with a good friend when we were travelling through Vietnam. Not for anything particularly exciting, it was a work trip, but we'd just done a pretty long plane ride and we were shattered, but we still wanted to get our nightcap in, so we ended up by the pool with this really crazy view of these skyscrapers in the back in Ho Chi Minh City, and I was like, I want to capture that. So we got a picture, and then I sort of spent a couple of days painting this up a little while later. But yeah, this one and a bunch of others are up on the Instagram. I guess if you're curious, a lot of the times that I did these larger paintings in the past, I actually used quite a lot of household emulsion paint, mainly because it was cheap and I had it laying around. But it does, like, I quite like the texture it used to give. It's got like it's got kind of a crunchy sort of relieved texture, which, yeah, sort of came with the fact that I had loads of this household paint over the top of everything. But yeah, if you want to see some more of that, head over to the Instagram, drop us a like and a subscribe if you don't mind, that'd be amazing. And yeah, hopefully I'll see you again for the next painting. Bye-bye.